Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Book Tribe podcast, where we interview subject matter experts on key skill areas for authors to help them build their authoring business. And today we're talking about trademarking with trademark attorney and owner of MAP law firm, Martha Pardo. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you for having me here.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you because I think that when authors start to think about, how do I publish my book? How do I promote my book? They don't necessarily think about trademarking. And maybe this is something that, once you've released a series that you start to consider, but we'll get into that in just a moment. Before we do, we've got to ask a bookish question, Martha. For you, I'm going to ask if there was one book that you could recommend to our listeners, what would that book be?
I am going to recommend Super Attractor by Gabrielle Bernstein. I read it a few months ago. It came at a very important time in my life, and I found it extremely helpful. It just kind of deals with how to explore different aspects of manifesting and spirituality. So just check it out. If it's a good fit, you'll know. And it was a really good book. So I wanted to share that with everyone.
Absolutely, because I think, the mindset piece, the manifestation piece, it's something that we've spoken about previously on season 1 of the podcast. And, mindset for authors is often challenging, that position of being able to accept or to acknowledge I am an author, my book deserves to be read. And then also looking, further forward, there are so many different parts of the journey of being an author that mindset and even manifestation are important things for authors to really think about, especially when it comes to setting up a business, because then being a business person is another layer on top of that. So I think that's a great recommendation. And in fact, I'm going to go check it out for myself.
You should. Yes, mindset is so important. It is the foundation for everything. So anyways, I could be talking about that all day. So
okay.
but let's get to
maybe another podcast then.
That's right.
Okay, so Martha, I just wondered if we could start with kind of learning a little bit more about your background. How did you end up in trademarking?
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. So this will be my 18th year of practice, and I am based out of Florida. I have had the majority of my career has been in public interest. So I've been helping low income individuals with different types of legal issues. I did have my firm a long time ago, but things changed and I went back into public interest. And after a few years of doing that, I decided to pivot and start my own firm. And one of the areas that I thought was extremely fascinating and would allow me to kind of have the best of both worlds was trademark law. So it's great to kind of pivot from a completely different area, help others in a different manner. But now I get to help businesses really protect their ideas and their dreams, and make sure that they are on the right path so that they, one, do not step on other people's toes inadvertently, and two, that once they have everything set up, that they are also protected so that nobody takes what they've worked hard for. So that's where I'm at now.
I love the way you put that. As in, businesses still have dreams, which is true. There's always a vision and a mission and an ambition and a goal. And I just love that. I love that kind of the emotional side of business as well. So I wondered if actually we might kind of just kickstart this conversation about trademarking for authors with just a quick explanation about what a trademark is. How is that different to copyright and patent? Where does it fit?
Absolutely. So, you hit on it, right? Copyrights, I think that is what most authors are familiar with because it really does protect the creative work, right? Especially for books, whatever they wrote, that is part of the protection for the copyright. Trademarks are a little bit different. They do expand on any goods or services. And so I think it still fits into the author world because you can trademark the title of a series. It's either 2 or more books if you have that. It can bleed into other types of things. So if you are offering any type of good or any type of service, and you have a really good name or a logo, design. They could be sounds, they could be smells. There's a lot of different things that can be trademarked. Obviously, the more common ones are names or logos, but that's important because you can have a really creative name or really creative design, and you want to make sure that it's how you set yourself out into the marketplace and what sets you apart from others. And so once you have that unique identifier, which is exactly what a trademark is, you want to make sure that you're protected. And then it depends on what categories you will be using it for. So there's several categories that you can apply for trademark protection. Unlike other types of maybe protections, right? So domain names where you can essentially snatch them up and never use them. Trademarks are use them or lose them, and they are limited to a certain degree to whatever goods or services you are going to be using them. So you can't just trademark something blanket for all different categories if you're not going to be using them in that. So it's meant to be protection, but also be competitive because you are in the marketplace.
Yeah, and that's really interesting actually to have that double-sided aspect of protection but also competitive advantage and or like, competition. I think it's really interesting, especially when you start to think about authors. It's just like, whoa, how does that play into, being an author and protecting your work, yes, but also being a competitive individual or product or in the market, because the book market in itself is a highly saturated market at the moment, and it's getting bigger. So when it comes to like the common mistakes, maybe it's mistakes, maybe it's misconceptions, but common mistakes that people make when it comes to trademarking, what do you see happen?
The most common one is choosing a generic name. That's not going to fly. So you have to be very distinct. Don't use descriptive words when you're coming up with a name because those can also cause problems. So the more unique you are, make up like names, or something that's a play on words can also be okay. But the two more common ones are the generic and the descriptive because they're just going to lead into problems if you are lucky enough to get through registration, because if it's generic it's never going to get registered because it defeats the whole purpose of what the trademark is, right, which is really to help you stand out in the marketplace. So if you look at it from that perspective, then it helps you kind of build that brand when you're trying to think about those names. So I'm not the most creative person in the world, so I can't help in that arena, but it's just something to consider as you're building this. Because a lot of the times I think what happens too is that, people come up with a name or a logo and it is very generic or it is very descriptive because that's what may work in a different context. But in the trademark world, it doesn't always translate well. And so it's very disappointing when you've already built something and then you try to get that registered and you just know that it's just not going to work. So it just leads to heartache.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because I guess, as you said, from a marketing perspective, you end up being told keep it really simple, be what
Yeah,
people can search on Google,
that's
and
right.
and then you have with the trademarking, well, generic doesn't necessarily work, and I suppose actually this is just part of the marketing exercise. If you've done the marketing exercise of understanding, um, you know when it comes to your marketing outreach, your website, your SEO, that you're using those generic terms, but everything brings you back to your unique selling
Yeah.
point, your unique brand, your unique quality, and your unique quality is what you're trademarking. So that's super, super interesting. And I guess what I'd like to know, and I guess what our listeners would like to know, is why is this important to fiction authors? I think we've already touched on this perhaps a little bit, but why do you think fiction authors should be considering this?
I think it's important because aside from the book series, right, if you are building a business around fiction, book writing. You could be offering other types of services that maybe have a similar name or a same name if you are building a business. It's important because you're going to get that protection depending on what services or what goods you're going to do, or whatever you're going to put out into the marketplace. And it is important to have that protection. One, because it does become an asset of your business, which means that you can eventually license that to others. You can sell it if you do plan on selling your business. So it is just an important thing to have. But it also offers, with the protection, if somebody goes out there and you already have it registered and they're using your name for something that is similar, it doesn't have to be the same, it just has to be similar goods or services of what you've already registered, then that also gives you remedies so that you can go after that person and say, no, no, this is mine, and you are infringing on my space, essentially. And then that can lead to some remedies as well as, just to make sure. And you do have a duty, right, to also make sure that you are policing, if you will, the use of your registered mark, because otherwise then it becomes, generic down the road, and then you lose those protections. So it does come, with some responsibility when you do have these registered, but they can be an asset to your company, and it also it's just good.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, when you start to think about kind of the saturated market of authors, and you have readers who are looking at what authors are out there, and you have this really strong author brand, you have trademarked, you have a trademark business. There's a sense of authenticity, a sense of this is legit. Like, even if you're a self-published author, there's a legitimization of your brand through trademarking, which I think is really interesting.
Absolutely. You were reading my mind. I do think it lends that level, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like legitimacy. You've invested your time and your money to go through this process, because it's not, I don't want to say it's a difficult process, but it's not an easy process either. And so, and it does take some time and some effort. And so if you've invested the time and the money and, to get to that level, it's kind of like it seals the deal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about kind of fiction writers, and they might be interested to know, beyond a book or a
Yeah.
book series, um, if is there a possibility of like trademarking a fictional world or a character? Is that different to trademarking perhaps a book or a service?
It depends on how they're going to use it. But yeah, if they have a character that kind of stands out and they're going to be using that, on merchandise, or that's going to be their brand name for like some with apparel or things like that, that will be the line name, for example, and not just a standalone. But if they're going to be using it, as a brand for different types of goods that they're going to be putting out into the world, that is important, because that's where you have that protection. So it can generate and become a life of its own, if you will. I think it just depends on what the vision is for the future, besides just the book series, right? So if they are planning on, throwing out toys, or, and that's going to be the line of what they're going to be putting out there, then that is something to think about.
And would the process be different? I'm going to talk about kind of the process in a second, but would it be different to kind of trademarking a book?
It wouldn't, in the sense of, so to meet the requirement for the book, it's the series, right? For the trademark piece, it's 2 or more. The process itself would probably be the same. I think the criteria would just be a little bit different. Depends on what goods or services you're going to be using that name for.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're going to be doing an apparel line, then there's certain things that, we need to make sure that you're checking the boxes when you're filing the application, so that you're not running into any issues with missing pieces or anything along those lines. So the boxes that you have to check might be a little bit different, but the process overall will be the same.
And so let's kind of give some transparency and visibility
Yeah,
over what that process looks like then. Can you
absolutely.
just like summarize what that process looks like for people?
Sure. Sure. So to me, the most important part of the trademark process is the search. And what the clearance search does is essentially searches anything that's already registered in the USPTO. And I'm talking about in the United States, the Patent and Trademark Office. They're the ones that are responsible for reviewing the applications and making sure everything's fine and then issuing the registrations. So first you have to make sure that nothing is registered already, because then you run into the issue. You can't have the same registration for the same thing or similar things, right? And so, or if there's any pending applications too, because if it does go to registration, then you're going to run into issues. So the search is really what's going to reveal what obstacles you may encounter as you're going through the registration process. Part of that search is also to identify what goods or services you're going to be offering, if you are already offering or will be offering. And I'll get to that in a second, with whatever you're going to, because of course, like I said earlier, it's going to fall into different categories. Now, if you're going to be offering them in all the categories that are available, great, that's where you file. But it's almost impossible. Nobody's going to be filing in all of the categories, right? But so you pick the ones that you are going to be offering or are offering already. So the search is going to reveal, like I said, those obstacles. Then you determine the level of risk for filing the application, assuming everything is, good to go. Then you file the application, where with all the information that you need, including those categories that you will be using it for or are using it for. And I'll pause there for just to kind of talk about trademarks. Like I said earlier, use them or lose them. There is an opportunity in the federal system to, if you are using it, great, because that's the route you go. But if you have a bona fide intent to be using the mark, then you can go ahead and still file a different type of application. The process is, mostly the same. There's a few differences in between, but essentially the USPTO gives you a little bit of extra time to show your use, because at the end of the day, you do have to show that you are using the mark. And so if you will be using the mark, they just give you a little bit of extra time. It's a little bit more paperwork, a little bit more filing fees. But it isn't a good alternative for folks that want to, get a jump start on the process and know that the launch of whatever it is that they're going to be offering is on the horizon. So, those are things to consider. Sometimes if it's too far ahead, then, you have to kind of time them. There is some strategy that goes behind that if you do plan on using it rather than are currently using it, but that's part of the process. So once you decide what application you're filing, you file it. The USPTO is taking about 7 months as of today, give or take, just to review the application. They'll make sure that you filed everything that you need, that all the requirements are met, and that to make sure that there is no confusion or that there's nothing similar out there. If everything goes smoothly, then they'll go ahead and they'll issue it for publication. That gives another opportunity for the world essentially to say, maybe there's something out there that they missed, or somebody's going to oppose it. But that's where that time frame happens. And then if everything is quiet, then they'll go ahead and they'll issue the registration. So you're looking at, without a lot of obstacles, I would calculate probably close to a year, maybe a little under, maybe a little over, depending on, where that process is. But, you can tell that it is not an overnight process. And so you do have to allow yourself that time to go through that, to make sure that you're planning for that, right? Like that you consider that as you're either launching or have already launched it, so that you know how in between you have, like, that level of exposure, I guess, too.
Yeah. And I think, with many things that actually, this is an investment into
Yes.
your business as an author. This isn't something that if you're publishing it just to share with your family and friends that perhaps you'll do. This is something that if you're looking to really make a business out of this, to create, new revenue streams for yourself through merch, through, there's other avenues for business there as well, that actually this is an investment into your long-term plan as a writer. And actually a year in the scheme of things isn't all that long, but as you say, you can plan that into potentially if you have a book that you're launching, it's the third book in a series, and that's the end of the full series, that maybe you can start to think about, planning the copyright for that series and building it from there. So I think, a year sounds like a long time, but then if you think about traditional publishing, it can take 2 years to publish a book. So in the scheme of things, that's probably, it sounds long, but actually it's probably not all that long if you're really, looking to add that aspect into your business. And so I guess the only other thing is the cost, because they'll be thinking, okay, that's investing time, sure, but then how much is this actually going to cost me to do? Now, obviously, we're talking about US specifically. I'm sure if listeners wanted to learn a bit more, if they were in a different geography, that they could go to maybe their local government site to understand what the processes are, and then maybe a trademark lawyer of that geography to find out what the cost might be. But in the US, what would an author be expecting to pay for a trademark?
So for filing fees alone, they can range anywhere from $250 per class to $350 per class. There's a bit of strategy there too, depending on who you work with. And that's just the filing fees for the USPTO for the initial application. Obviously, you have to file, if you are looking for professional help for the use of a trademark lawyer, those fees can range, and they're from all over the place. So I can only kind of speak for myself, and I'll use it as a ballpark range because it really does depend on the individual, what they're trying to do, kind of how many trademarks they're going to file, in what kind of categories, how many. We could be here all day. But, you're looking at a good about $2,000 investment, and that's kind of on, I don't know if it's a mid-range or a low range, but I would just kind of have that ballpark figure in there. And then it could obviously be more, it could be a little less, but I think that's a good starting point to think about how that works. Obviously, that's going to depend on geography and what you're getting for that. So it's just important to, do research and find somebody that, if you are going to be using professional help, which I always recommend for a variety of reasons, make sure that you're also doing your due diligence and that you find somebody that you feel comfortable working with, because it is important to have that good rapport with the professional that you're going to work with.
Yeah, in every aspect, whether it's a solicitor or whether it's a book coach,
Yes.
there's always that requirement to work with people that you feel comfortable working with. You don't just have to because everyone else is, it's there has to be that kind of comfortable relationship to be able to have those honest conversations with people. And as part of the process, there's a lot of paperwork and documentation as part of that process. As a fiction author, is there anything specific that they might need to include? If we kind of take the book series as a prime example, is there anything that they specific requirements for that documentation that they might need to include, or is it kind of a bog standard process?
Well, the USPTO is going to ask for proof of use, right? So they're going to look at, depends on what it is that you're trying to file for. Usually websites, if they're service-based businesses, could be, it. If you are in cosmetics, they want, if it's any type of product, you really want to have the actual product either on a shelf, or if you are using it, via online services, in some sort of shopping cart, right? So you have to show that you are using this in commerce. As it relates to books, usually the spine of the book, mock-ups are not going to cut it. So you do need the actual book, and so that you can show where that it's actually a living thing, I guess, if you want to see it that way. So, and then that gets submitted, and then they review that, and then they determine whether that's sufficient. So sometimes they don't quite like it. And so as long as you're using it, just make sure that you document. That goes with any type of service or any type of good. Make sure you're documenting how you're using it, kind of try to have those, handy so that you can be able to show the proof that, it exists. Because that's really what it's going to boil down to. Even if you applied for the intent to use, once you're ready and using it, that's where you have to show. So it's important to document that, and even along the journey of the registration of how you're continuing to use the mark, to kind of capture that along the way, so that because like I said, mock-ups aren't going to cut it. Like visual, like virtual conceptions are not going to cut it. So
right, yeah. And so I guess obviously we're probably speaking about authors who are already making a reasonable amount from their books, and if they're at that point, then they probably have printed versions of their books.
Yes.
But my question really is, do ebooks count?
They can,
or would it have to be
if they're even you just have to find like how to show that it is in the marketplace. So if it's and
Amazon
to make sure that it's
shopping basket?
I mean, or if they have just to make sure that it is the series, because that's really what's going to count for the trademark. So as long as you can show, obviously if it's not a printed book, but the ebooks should count as long as they are the series.
Yeah, because you can, on Amazon, you can put your books into a collection and give the collection or series a title. So there is that series formatting that you can put onto it, and often, just from a reader's experience, a lot of authors, they give each series like a little name, like just Tattered and Torn series, or like the Windy City series, or so there's always things like that you see already. So that's kind of like a hack, I guess. So we've spoken about books. There's also like the series. We've also spoken about potentially merch as well. Off the top of your head, do you think there's any other opportunity for authors to kind of trade? Are there any other things that authors can trademark?
We're in a podcast, and podcasts are also, marketable. It's probably not a word, but you can register, the names of podcasts. And so that, with the popularity of how it's increased over the years, if you are looking at doing that as well, that's something to also consider as part of that. I think, the key is it can take on a lot of different forms. And again, it is really going to depend on what categories those goods or services are going to, which ones they're going to fall under and which ones they're going to use. I think we've touched on probably the more common ones but the sky's the limit sometimes. Somebody could be really creative and think that that name is going to, carry over into something that we probably didn't think about. But I think the main premise is, if you are going to be building a business, it's definitely something to consider, and especially as you continue to develop and grow your business. So, because you want to be protected as much as you can.
Yeah, I guess that's the only thing. I've not lent into risk too much today, because I don't want authors to feel like it's a scary thing and scare them into doing it. But I guess, there is an element of protection, of the, there is a risk of stuff happening if you don't do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're going to get very, very, very basic protections if you don't register, but they are limited. And, it's really, you're going to get broader protections and easier to prove protections if you do register. So I, like you, don't like to scare people, but it is important to assess the risk, right? And know so that you can make an informed decision whether or not this is right for you. But just like you are exposed in the world, right, without having that protection, then you run the risk that you can, go up for litigation because, somebody's taking your name. And so the types of ways that you can enforce that can just be limited if you aren't registered, right? So that's one piece. The flip side, which I talked about earlier, is also true. You could be going around the world thinking you have this awesome name, and you probably do, but maybe somebody else already has something that is very similar, if not the same, doing the same thing you are, and you are essentially taking theirs without meaning to, but ill will is not going to get you off the hook, or lack of ill will, by the way. It won't get you off the hook. And so you have to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. And of course, those things can change, but knowing what's out there is also equally important, because there is nothing more disheartening than investing your time, your energy, your money, and you've really poured a lot of emotion, because I know we talked about that earlier too. Like, there is a lot of emotion that goes when you're building your business, right? And there's excitement, it's a roller coaster, and there's nothing more disappointing than finding out it belongs to somebody else. And then you have to go back to the drawing board. And it is not an easy process, especially depending on how far along you are in that process. It's costly. And so, I'm gonna butcher this saying, but there's like an ounce of prevention is worth something, so early on, and I didn't even get it right, but early on in the process, it can be, I know when you start a business, every penny counts. I get it. But you do have to prioritize what you're going to invest in, especially as you have visions to grow, because like I said, nothing more disheartening than pouring yourself into something and then just finding out it belongs to somebody else, and then you have to start from scratch. It's horrible.
Yeah. And I think there's also the company name as well, because even in sort of my experience, that I've not been able to use a name because it's also already a company name. So I don't know if the two are connected, but actually, if I was someone setting up a business, the first thing I'd do is to check to see if the company name is actually available. And then if it's not, then that's your first kind of defense, really, of saying, well, is someone else using this as a company? No, okay, that's fine. And then from there, and also a trademark doesn't have to be a company name, does it?
Correct.
It could be, anything. But
correct. Yeah.
If you're building a business, then the first place to start will probably be your company name.
Right. And sometimes they're the same, right? Sometimes you have a really awesome company name, and that is the name that you're going to be using in the marketplace for all these different goods or services, and that's the name you go for, right? But if you are developing different things with the different names, that's where you have to go into those considerations of what it is that you're using it for. Because again, I'm going to hammer this as much as I can. Use it or lose it, and who's using it and how. And all those things are the considerations that you have to take into play when you're talking about a trademark. But you are absolutely right. If your first, search is your company name, and it's a great starting point because that's where most of us start, and it's already taken, it's not to say that it's an immediate red flag. However, you know that you might have some challenges down the road. So that's why it's equally important to consult with a professional to figure out, how much, if any, of a red flag this is going to be as you embark on your journey. Same thing with domain names. And I think there's another misconception. Just because you have a domain name doesn't mean that you have a trademark. Just because you register your business with your whatever entity it is in your jurisdiction, that doesn't give you trademark protection. So it may give you, obviously you have the domain name, nobody else is going to use it, and you have your business entity set up, but that doesn't automatically give you trademark rights. And that is I think a huge misconception that people sometimes think, oh, I'm already protected, but it's not that cut and dry. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, even my dad has been through this process of having to rename a business because someone else already in the technology sector had a business called Jigsaw. So, it had to go he had to go right back to the beginning, and it's a difficult process. It took months to say, okay, we'll change it. That's fine. It's yours first. But actually, then to go back to the drawing board, sometimes it really throws you. So yeah, that preventative measure is definitely important. And when it comes to, I'm going to go back to just kind of this brand piece for an author. I guess we've already touched on it, but how then can trademarking help to kind of build that brand recognition and credibility? Is there a way of, I guess, leveraging it?
I mean, I think there can be, right? It really does depend on what your goals are and what the marketplace also dictates. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if you have a trademark, you can license it. So if there's others out there that you think it might be a good fit or they want to use it, then that gives you the opportunity to be able to license that. That's a whole other ball game as well. But it is an option, especially as you continue to grow and expand, and you have those registrations already in place. So I think that's a good leverage point. When you look at it from the business perspective, it really does kind of lend itself to a lot of possibilities. So I think it really is also going to depend on the individual and what their vision is, because we did talk about this a little bit, but like if they are going to be offering toys or apparel, or I like I said, I am not creative, so I cannot think of all these things, but the sky's the limit if you really wanted to, if you are going to be using this in the marketplace. And as long as it falls under those, categories, then you just need to make sure that you are protected. So it it lends itself to a lot of different possibilities. I'm in my head thinking of very popular, books, right? And how they've
Yes.
morphed into different things, including, obviously movies and all that other, all types of entertainment, things that can, obviously that will also fall under copyright. So the worlds collide to a certain degree. But I think the biggest thing that probably pops out of that is merchandising and what kinds of goods they're going to be selling, right? With that
Yeah.
name. So it gets a little complicated that we probably won't have enough time in a podcast. And it's probably better suited for an individual basis just to kind of walk through what all those requirements are. But I think the main piece is if you do plan on making this a business rather than just, writing, which it has its own protections, right? But if you are looking at it for a business, trademarking, you should definitely at least consider it and figure out how it fits into your big puzzle.
Yeah, I guess what's coming out of that for me is like, there's a lot of independent sellers of bookish merch. So there are people who do things like bookmarks, or they do jumpers with like sayings on them. And
Right.
they're often from, popular books, and like almost mainstream books. But I guess if there is an author listening who happens to have a popular book, or has had incredible reception, because you do get these these viral books that kind of come out of nowhere and you're like, well, okay, who's this person? But to have that trademark and to be able to license it to people who want to produce merch with your trademark, then I don't know, can they charge for that? Or is it just another way of getting their brand out?
I think it's going to depend. So there goes the lawyer answer. Because it really is going to depend for the type of merchandise and how they're branding it, if you will, and what they're putting on there. So there could, like I said, trademark and copyright worlds sometimes collide, and often they do. So if it's a, standalone character, for example, and that's being part of, let's say, a separate type of, I lost my train of thought, a separate thought of whatever they're putting it on, maybe it doesn't quite fall under a trademark, but it will depend on what it is that they're putting out there. So I think the easiest way to figure out the trademark piece is your name, what is your name being associated with in the marketplace? So if you have a line of candles, for example, and that line of candles is called XYZ, then that's what you're really branding and putting out, and that's what's being trademarked. But you can have a line of candles XYZ because that's the brand, and then have like something else on the front of it that in and of itself may not be the trademark. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think so.
It's really difficult sometimes, those little nuances, right? But to answer your question, yes, it can be a trademark depending on how you're putting it and what you're licensing for, right? But at the same time, there could be other implications that may not be trademark. It could be copyright, and that could potentially also be licensed. So you have to go into that individual analysis and see what it is exactly that you have in mind, or what are you using it already that you need to make sure that if you haven't been protected, that you do get those up and running.
So ask a professional.
Yes, because it is going to be important. Like, how is it? And those are questions that they're going to ask you, right? Like, well, where are you using this? How are you using this? Is it already in the marketplace? Is this just something that's living in your head? Which is fine. But these are things that you definitely have to consider. And, depending on where you are in the process, there's different things that you have to do and what you may fall under for that protection. So it's important to know that.
Great stuff. Well, we're actually running out of time quite quickly, actually. So I want to make sure that we've addressed some important points for authors. I wondered if there were any specific kind of resources or tools that can help authors to understand or navigate the trademarking process. Absolutely. Are there any that you might recommend?
Yeah, I mean, the USPTO has amazing resources and they're pretty straightforward. So it's a great way to kind of immerse yourself into what is a trademark and what works and what doesn't, and things to look for. So they do have a lot of great resources out there. They also have a search tool. So if you're ever wondering if any idea that you have in there might already be taken, there is a search function as well for their database. I will put in a disclaimer, just because it doesn't pop up doesn't mean that it's not out there, and it's not a substitute for professional help. But I think it's an excellent starting point for folks that want to kind of have an idea, because that if it's coming back so quickly when you pop something in there, you may know that you have some red flags. So it's a great tool. Same thing with, doing a very common Google search, although you may get a bunch of things too. So the disclaimer there as well is, it may or may not, come back and be a red flag. But again, that's where the professional can help navigate through that. But and I think you touched on this earlier too. If you are going to start off with a business and you are in, for example, in the United States, the appropriate Secretary of State where you register, that's an excellent starting point as well to see, if your name is already taken or a variation of it. So you have an idea. There is a lot to learn. The information can be very overwhelming, and you may not know it all, but, I am a huge believer in getting knowledge, and so that you can make informed decisions, and it at the very least can help you formulate questions that you may not know that you need to ask, but at least it'll help you kind of point you in the right direction. So those are just some good starting points.
Well, thank you for that, Martha. And I'm going to ask you as the last question of our session today, and thank you so much for your time. It's been great to chat to you. Do you have any kind of final advice for authors around, trademarking?
Just think about it, right? And at least learn a little bit more about it if you're not familiar with them, because even if you are familiar with them, because I think we're all familiar with trademarks in our everyday world, but how that may apply from the business perspective and as a business owner and through the business lens. So all I can say is don't discard it. Try to think about of how it can apply to you. And when in doubt, ask, seek out the help that you may need so that you can make that decision, because it can be a very powerful tool and a very powerful asset, depending on where you are or where you want to go.
Great stuff. Well, this has been a great introduction into trademarking for authors. I think we've covered some really important points of why it's important, what the process might look like, just to kind of demystify it a little bit. So, Martha, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful. For our listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more from subject matter experts like Martha, then make sure to subscribe to the Book Tribe podcast channel, or you can join the Book Tribe author community to connect with our author service partner network, and to make connections with other authors. But in the meantime, just keep on writing. Martha, once again, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
It has been my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. This was awesome.